Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the Ideas ASEAN Prosperity Initiative Forum. Thank you very much for those of you who joined us yesterday. Thanks for coming back. And for those of you joining today, welcome. So this is the second day in our two-day forum to discuss issues of ASEAN integration under the Ideas project, the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative. So this project is designed to provide a platform for researchers and academics, policymakers, and the private sector to discuss issues relevant to ASEAN integration, to consider the trends, both positive and negative, with respect to the individual member states and their collective efforts to strengthen their economies through regional integration. I think we can all recognize that this year has been a challenging year for ASEAN, as it has for economies across the planet. But we do believe that there is still scope to further deepen economic ties between ASEAN member states as a pathway to economic recovery from the pandemic. In the discussion yesterday, we discussed the recent signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or Rcep, and what this implies for the prospects of ASEAN integration, given that ASEAN was a driving part in securing that agreement. I think that discussion was interesting in highlighting how, in I suppose, the pattern of ASEAN integration initiatives, often ambitious policy commitments, then face the challenge of the divergent interests and strategies of the different member states, and how we can reconcile those two to ensure that ASEAN and its member states enjoy broadly based, sustainable economic growth, and how we can use the levers of tools like Rcep and other mechanisms of economic integration in the region to achieve that goal. Now, today, we are discussing the question of migration. Now, this has been a long been a driver of ASEAN integration, has been the movement of people within ASEAN. That's something that predates most of the formal economic agreements, but is a central part of the ASEAN economy. What we want to discuss today is some of the challenges in ASEAN migration. We recognize that at the regional level, policy with respect to migration tends to focus in certain areas and maybe not in others, whereas the main drivers of migration is often among low-skilled workers or even undocumented workers. Regional policy tends to focus on the areas of high-skilled migration, such as mutual recognition of qualifications. And we think that system has been put under particular strain in the context of the pandemic, with the closure of borders, putting constraints on the supply of migrants, and also some of the social and health conditions that migrants are under in different ASEAN member states, highlighting some of the inequitable conditions that migrants face across ASEAN. So in that context, we want today's discussion to consider the current state of ASEAN migration, what it means for ASEAN member state economies, and what it means for ASEAN integration. And then as we progress through the pandemic and hopefully to a recovery, what that will mean for the future of ASEAN migration. So in the short term, of course, is the discussion of when will borders be able to fully reopen, and how ASEAN member states can move towards that stage. But also, how can we then, moving beyond that, learn the lessons that the pandemic has highlighted in terms of the treatment of migrants, the regulation and governance of migrant flows, and that covers the full spectrum of movement of people, not just focusing on the high skilled. So lots of interesting and some difficult topics to get into, but we feel that this is an issue that needs to be given a platform for debate. So I'm very excited with our panel today to discuss these issues, and we're going to hear, I think, both from the perspective of the pandemic at a regional level, but also sort of some specific local stories that I think bring out some of the issues that we've been discussing this morning. So I will introduce our panelists shortly as we move into the panel discussion. But first, I'm going to invite my colleague Armand Azra, who is a research executive at Ideas and has been working on the issue of migration within ASEAN, to give a presentation on the current dynamics of ASEAN migration, just to frame this morning's discussion. So over to you, Armand.
Right, thank you, Laurence, and thank you everyone for coming. Just give me a second while I bring out my slides. Yeah, so these slides are based upon the paper that we just released last week on ASEAN migration, but it's just going to be a very short and summary of what happened there. So if you want a deeper look, then you can go look at the paper. But yeah, so basically the paper's focus was supposed to be on intra-regional migration because it was part of the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative. But because of how labor is seen in ASEAN, especially in labor receiving countries, and how they treat migrants in particular and what they intend to gain from migrants, they don't tend to make the distinction between acquiring cheap and disposable labor. So in that sense, it started touching upon all sorts of migration as well. But then, yeah, so just a quick summary of that. So this is a composition of ASEAN migration versus GDP per capita. As you can see, intra-regional migration still makes a very big part of migration as a whole. And that comes in tandem with the GDP growth in the area. Even with all the data we have though, this data does not capture the full picture of intra-regional migration, because even intra-regionally, it's estimated that around 40% of total intra-ASEAN migration is essentially irregular migration, meaning that it's undocumented. So we don't have the full picture of ASEAN migration, but even with what we do have, this is, it still makes up a big part of migration. So this is especially the case with border countries, because it's easier to come in and out. And because of that, a lot of countries have done memorandums of understandings, which are bilateral agreements, basically acknowledging the migration between countries and acknowledging kind of having some sort of protection towards that kind of flows. So this is taken from, this is modified from a different academic paper, the source is over there, but basically, yeah, so whenever there is a sort of flow between countries, there's always, these memorandum of agreements are not the precursors, but basically just as a reaction to a lot of migration that's happening in ASEAN. So basically it is something that is happening in a regional thing since before a lot of these institutions came about. And as we can see, what we see in intra-regional migration is a lot of migrations are concentrated into certain countries. As you can see there, the darker color is by origin and the lighter color is by destination. Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand house most of the intra-regional migration. And to see why that happens, it's, we can break it down into the most obvious factor is wage differentials and remittances, which are the primary driving factors for large cross-border and intra-ASEAN migration. So most of it is driven by uneven levels of development, basically. So the first figure here, as you can see, is about the ratio of destination to origin country, meaning how much GDP per capita, the ratio of the GDP per capita between the migration corridors. The only corridor that's the exception here is Singapore to Malaysia, which Singapore obviously has a higher GDP per capita than Malaysia, but then the rest of them, most of the migration goes to countries that are basically 2 to 3 times higher GDP than their origin country. And when you look at wages as well, that's reflected. In Thailand, for example, wages is about 3 times more than Cambodia, Laos, and Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, the average wages, I mean, and basically a lot of that goes into remittances, where a lot of low-wage migrants come from a lot of lesser developed countries, come to the more developed countries in order to gain a certain level of income to send it back to their own countries. Yeah, so how I categorized it in the paper is there's a clear, not clear cutoff point, but there is a sort of cutoff point between countries that often have a net outflow, which is often have less GDP per capita than the ASEAN average, and the countries that often have a net inflow of migrants often have a higher GDP per capita than the ASEAN average. Yeah, but then regional governance for the ASEAN migrants tend to focus mostly on high wage migrants. I make the distinction here between high wage migrants and low wage migrants rather than high skilled migrants and low skilled migrants, because I think it's a lot more accurate. But basically, a lot of ASEAN focus has been on since 2007 at least, on high wage migrants, because there's that what was it? Intent to be able to move these skills that they think are valuable around. So basically, the movement of natural persons, for example, focuses on temporary migration between ASEAN states, and the Comprehensive Investment Agreement as well focuses entirely on capital and how much capital someone can invest in a country. And then the last one would be the mutual agreements, which are essentially a lot of them focus on very specific skills. So there's the MRA on engineering, nursing, and whatnot. But a lot of the focus on high wage migrants is basically focusing on something that isn't the reality of migration, which is a lot of it's mostly low wage migrants, and that's the people that need the most vulnerable in the situation and need the most protection. And that's why there needs to be a more regional framework to be able to protect these migrants, essentially. And so what's the problem of low wage migration that needs better governance? Essentially, what the research has shown is essentially there's kind of a structure of a migrant industry that comes about as a whole that's essentially between labor receiving ASEAN member states and labor sending ASEAN member states that kind of artificially increases the total amount of migrants, essentially increases the total amount of migrants, not necessarily following like a flow, but essentially what that means is often the cost gets pushed to migrants themselves. So like, let's say this is how a structure of labor receiving and labor sending ASEAN member states look like. So in ASEAN labor receiving states such as Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, migrants are often excluded from social protections. I think Benjamin Harkins' paper report talked a bit about that when he talked about the minimum wage law in 2013, for example, that did not include low wage migrants. Especially considering the fact that a lot of companies actually in Malaysia, especially often when they hire low wage migrants, they expect to not pay them a proper wage. So they often ask for exclusion from having to conform to these laws. And the reason for that is that a main focus on labor receiving ASEAN member states is that they require a steady source of cheap labor because they want to facilitate economic growth in local economies. labor receiving, and because of that, that's what we're talking about in the first slide, where labor receiving ASEAN member states don't really differentiate between regional and global migration in this sense. What they're really looking for is cheap migration, cheap labor costs. And that essentially, what that essentially does is creates an industry, if you will, that takes advantage of poverty and vulnerability. Often a lot of SMEs and companies in a lot of labor receiving states have links to a lot of their ASEAN member states, meaning that there's often vulnerable to lobbying and whatnot. Singapore in 1985 or something like that, when they wanted to increase the minimum wage, what happened was a lot of PAP backbenchers and a lot of SMEs were completely against it and essentially just stopped it in the tracks. And we just talked about how Malaysia did it as well just now. And enforcement of migration, like especially illegal migration, tends to be more of a coercive thing in order to force migrants to be more accepting of their poor working conditions. So essentially, a lot of labor receiving countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand have more pro-employer policies when it comes to punitive measures and sanctions. Malaysia as well has a volunteer corps that's just focused on tracking and searching illegal immigration. So essentially what that does is that makes migrants less likely to be able to be in a position to be able to better their conditions. On the side of the labor sending ASEAN member states, there seems to be a case for recruitment agencies that facilitate high migrations, but they tend to, how they manage to keep costs low is they shift all the cost of migration to the migrants themselves. So what often happens is what you hear about debt bondage and what you hear about how migrants come here with like a lot of debt essentially. That's what that's about. Recruitment agencies push the cost to migrants, and that allows them to be cheaper towards labor receiving countries, and essentially basically working off that debt rather than making any sort of wealth from themselves. And because of, the reason for this is because the motivation for this is to supply as much labor as possible, because a lot of ASEAN labor sending countries do depend on remittances, and they do depend upon a lot of their immigrants for economic growth. And that has essentially become the policy until now. There has been a lot of pushback and backlash towards that, especially on the labor sending ASEAN member state sides, but essentially there's that kind of contention between migrants and their origin country. And labor sending ASEAN member states often have a sort of patronage relationship with their recruitment agencies, which makes regulations much more difficult, especially since the state itself as well gains economic growth when it comes to issues of migration. So the implications of the emergence of a migrant industry is that abuse and exploitation are structural issues in the migrant industries to keep the costs low. So enforcement is meant to keep migration costs low. How migration is structured in the labor sending ASEAN member states is as well with recruitment agencies and with a lot of their even official government departments is often to keep migration flowing without any proper protection. So basically, like, migrants have the most to lose within this industry, essentially, because their costs are kept low, and essentially, Yeah. Excessive immigration from labor sending countries may also further development the gap, because when excessive immigration happens, what happens is there's a supply and demand mismatch in their origin country as well. And a lot of countries like the Philippines, for example, had a national policy of exporting migrants at the start in order to be a temporary measure, but for now, it seems to be very structural, so it's hard to kick off the habit. But essentially, it's just difficult to develop a country without if you have a labor deficit. And this becomes kind of diverging incentives for each member states, as labor sending states tend to want to gain as much as possible from sending migrants, while us, the labor receiving states, want to gain as much as possible from low cost migration. And how the migration industry is structured kind of suggests that the gains are, suggests that the gains made have not been distributed very equitably. Labor receiving countries especially become dependent on cheap disposable labor, which disincentivizes investment in human capital and capital upgrading. This is pretty much worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. So what has essentially happened is that the pandemic has exposed how important low-wage migration has within more developed states. In Singapore, for example, migrant work has been essential to the economy, and a lot of efforts have been taken to put a lot of labor-intensive industries back to work. I think, like in Singapore, construction is a majority, if not wholly, made of migrants. And in Thailand as well, in July, it announced that it will allow migrant workers to come back to work. More than 3,000 foreign teachers have been accepted entry into Thailand, highlighting its increasing reliance on foreign workers. It also exposed the health and social risk of many of these migrants are living, because there's a lot of low quality living conditions and inadequate access to health, which increases the risk infection among the migrant population. I think this was a particular issue in Singapore at the start of the pandemic, and it's become a particular issue in Malaysia now. So essentially, how do we deal with these problems? The paper gave a couple of recommendations. Our first recommendation was to ratify the International Labour Conventions, which are conventions made by the International Labour Organization, which aims to protect labor rights, essentially. Ratification of some of the conventions may prove useful in providing to the region a catalyst for regional integration, because it can become a sort of standard, like all ASEAN member states can have a standard or uniformity when it comes to protecting labor and migrants, essentially. So this is very relevant because, as we talked about before, divergence in policy when it comes to labor and migrants has been a large issue in ASEAN, and that's in order for regional integration to happen in that sense, it's more important to have a standard. So these are some of the conventions that we looked at that were relevant to what we were talking about. A lot of them are pretty much self-explanatory, and a lot of them also work in tandem with together. The right to organize and collective bargaining, for example, works well together with the freedom of association and protection of right to organize. And we can see here the ratification process for each ASEAN member state is getting somewhere, but then obviously, like just now when I was talking about Convention 87 and 98, for example, Malaysia and Singapore ratified 98, which is the right to collectively bargain, but then they don't have the right to freely associate. So what essentially happens is make it difficult for a lot of low-wage labor and low-wage migrants to cooperate, in a sense. Malaysia essentially, for example, requires you to register with various departments in order to create any sort of organization. So without the ratification of that, the ratification of the right to collectively bargain is essentially useless in itself. Yeah, not useless, but yeah, so it's important that a lot of these ratifications work in tandem with each other to create a standard and framework for the region. Our second recommendation is that ASEAN member states should take steps to reduce the abuses of the migration industries and strengthen the agency of individual migrants in improving the accountability of recruitment agencies and also local SMEs or just local businesses. So for example, include allowing a more streamlined and easier way for the visa application on arrival to reduce the power of recruitment agencies. Documentation regarding migration should be personal to the migrants, in contrast to the current practice of it being held by agencies or employers. A lot of the times when agencies and employers hold it as well, it's illegal, but then there's no repercussions. So that goes on to what I'm saying next, which is punitive measures should be directed from the migrants to the recruitment agencies and the employers to discourage exploitative and abusive practices. Because essentially what I'm trying to say there is that a lot of times migrants bear the brunt of punitive measures, and employers and recruitment agencies seem to get away with it easily. So in that sense, more resources should focus on the recruitment agencies and the businesses rather than the migrants themselves. Lastly, the ASEAN community as well could benefit from a coherent labor plan to organize migrants to reach optimal capacity for economic growth. So essentially what the idea for this came from how Europe, for example, recovered from World War II. And since we're facing our own crisis as a whole, I think this is a good opportunity to restructure how we see how we organize. So in a sense, like one of our papers argued that a lot of global multinational corporations are probably going to make Southeast Asia its manufacturing hub. So this gives some sort of bargaining power to the ASEAN community and especially the lesser developed ASEAN member states to catch up by directing their migrants to manufacturing industries and shifting their production towards more regional chains. The increased bargaining power as well would give each country the opportunity to improve their labor situation and improve their global standing rather than participate in a race to the bottom. So I think that was an issue when it came to a lot of labor sending countries as well. For example, Indonesia with the omnibus law tried to cut labor costs in order to compete with Vietnam, but Vietnam itself is trying to improve its labor situation. So that's really not the way to go about it. A race to the bottom is not the way to go about it. Regional integration and regional cooperation is a better outlook for just total regional welfare as a whole. Yeah, so that's all I have. This is just a few references that I have. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Armand. Okay, so I think, what we see is that obviously migration within the region is potentially should be a driver for growth. It presents opportunities for migrants themselves, and it's an important part of providing a more flexible supply of labor within different member states. But there's sort of, I think, two issues that really come through, right? So the first is a question of the risk of a sort of economic bifurcation in the ASEAN labor market, where we have just very concentrated sending states and very concentrated receiving states, and whether that is actually positive in the long run in terms of economic development, and that plays out in terms of whether we promote reliance on remittances and whether we're in those sending countries and promote reliance on cheap labor in the receiving countries and so on. And I think the second dimension is more of a social problem of whether the absence of strong enough governance on the movement of low skilled workers creates the space for exploitation and abuse that obviously results in deeper social issues. So these are some of the issues that we want to discuss in the panel. So I'm very excited by the three speakers we have today. So what I will do is I will introduce each speaker in turn and ask them just to give their opening remarks. And then we will move to a Q&A. But please, if anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to start putting them in the Q&A box and I'll come back round to them in the discussion. So I'm going to call first on Mr. Benjamin Harkins, who in fact Armand referred to also in his presentation. So Benjamin is the Senior Program Manager at the UNOPS, and he is the Senior Program Manager for the Decent Work and Labour Mobility Program. So he studied at California and holds an MA in International Development Studies from Chulalongkorn University. And he is experienced in the issues of movement of labor and some of the topics that Armand has focused on. His work is focused on enhancing the evidence base for labor migration governance within the region, building the capacity of governments and social partners on results-based management, and increasing the rigor of the project's monitoring and evaluation system. So please, Benjamin, over to you for your opening remarks.
Okay. Thanks, Laurence. Yeah, I'd like to start by thanking the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs for inviting me to present today. I will take this opportunity to talk a bit about the impact of COVID-19 on migrant workers and their families within ASEAN, but I'd also like to share some thoughts on how I think ASEAN policy on labor migration needs to be strengthened in response. Inter-regional labor migration has really been an issue of growing importance for ASEAN countries for quite a while now. According to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the number of migrants from Southeast Asia heading to other countries within the region has actually increased fivefold during the last 2.5 decades, and it's now reached around 7 million. Women migrant workers make up almost half of that number, and we know that they're likely undercounted due to the higher level of informality of their work. As we know, and this was mentioned by Armand earlier, that official data also does not capture the millions more migrants who are employed without regular legal status in the region. However, what we know is that, yes, the outbreak of COVID-19 has severely disrupted labor mobility within ASEAN, and it's placed the health, livelihoods, and human rights of migrants severely at risk. Strict lockdown measures in the region's main destination countries of Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore has led to a massive loss of income and employment for migrants, particularly because migrants tend to be the first to lose their jobs. In addition, the official data suggests that more than 500,000 migrants have returned home within ASEAN. And I think we have to acknowledge that that's probably a very conservative estimate. I think it's probably a higher number. For those who remain in destination countries, they are generally excluded from COVID-19 stimulus packages and policy responses. And that includes things like wage subsidies, unemployment benefits, and other health and social protection measures. In Singapore, containment measures largely missed the migrant worker population entirely, as they were simply not considered in plans for the city's residents. By September, the dormitories, which house over 300,000 migrant construction and shipbuilding workers, accounted for almost 95% of Singapore's infections. In Malaysia, migrants and asylum seekers were subjected to a severe crackdown on irregular legal status in May, with immigration raids and arrests leading to a surge of infections within immigration detention centers. In Thailand, The hastily announced border closures in March triggered a very chaotic exodus of migrants from Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, and that was largely without social distancing measures or quarantine protocols in place to prevent infection. What we know is that there have also been serious knock-on economic impacts for the millions of migrant households in countries of origin in Southeast Asia who are heavily dependent on remittance. I worked on an analysis with UNCDF where we calculated that the decline in remittances in Myanmar alone could be as much as $2 billion this year. And that's going to hit the 2.1 million direct recipients particularly hard. For ASEAN as a whole, the World Bank is currently projecting about a 9% decline in remittance inflows for 2020. And those remittances serve to diversify and smoothen household incomes and are particularly critical to strengthening the financial resilience of women, rural populations, and ethnic minorities within ASEAN. I think we can say that the speed of the economic recoveries in Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore will likely have a considerable cross-border impact on restoring financial safety nets for vulnerable populations in less developed states of ASEAN. Sorry about that. Another major feature of the COVID-19 pandemic for migrants has been that it has substantially exacerbated problems with labor exploitation. Even under normal circumstances, labor rights violations against migrants, such as charging of excessive recruitment fees, contract substitution, wage theft, withholding of documents, and other abuses are very common. With severe restrictions on mobility in place during COVID-19, working conditions for migrant workers have become even more precarious and abuses have really proliferated. Tied visas and work permits, which already create a relationship of dependency between migrants and their employers, are now coupled with declining business revenue in destination countries. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that not paying wages due to migrants has become an increasingly prevalent way in which employers have sought to cope with this problem. A Myanmar fisherman we interviewed for a study in Thailand recently told us, while we normally get paid every 3 months, our employer now won't tell us when we will receive our wages. They're holding all of our IDs and personal documents, and no one dares go to the authorities for assistance. I think in my view, we should take COVID-19 as a bit of a reality check for ASEAN policy on labor migration. ASEAN governments have long acknowledged the potential for intra-regional migration to contribute to the economic growth and development of the bloc, including through the mutual recognition arrangements to support a freer flow of skilled labor. However, very few professionals have made use of these policies as they are mostly unresponsive to the sectors in which migrants are employed, represent just a small fraction of the regional labor market, and many non-legal barriers to mobility remain in place. The unspoken truth that we all know is that the vast majority of the workers involved in intra-ASEAN labor migration are employed in low-skilled, labor-intensive jobs that are not covered by these policies. In particular, many women migrants remain segregated in low-skilled sectors of work that are associated with lower wages and weaker labor protections, such as domestic work. And that gap does not fairly reflect the importance of low-skilled migration of women and men within ASEAN countries, as the prosperity of whole regions and economic sectors are heavily dependent on the labor and earnings of these workers. With COVID-19 leading to the closure of borders and increasingly complex procedures for admission and employment of migrant workers being put into place, the number of migrant workers needed to fill labor shortages are simply unavailable. I think this is going to make it increasingly hard for ASEAN governments to avoid coming to terms with the need for a more comprehensive regional policy on labor migration. So far, the efforts made to extend labor rights and social protection to migrants in ASEAN have left a considerable portion of the population behind. The ASEAN Consensus on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers, which was signed by ASEAN leaders in 2017, was the product of a full decade of closed-door negotiations among the 10 ASEAN member states. Yes, the signing of the consensus was a step forward for ASEAN policy towards migrant workers. The final consensus is non-binding, and it makes much of its contents subject to the stipulations of national policies and legislation. In doing so, it leaves the status quo of insufficient labor and social protections largely unchanged. It also does not extend any rights to the sizable population of undocumented migrant workers within ASEAN, unless they become so through quote unquote, no fault of their own. In practical terms, I think we can say adherence to the articles of the consensus has been made largely optional for ASEAN member states. Although COVID-19 has undeniably had a dramatic impact on labor migration within ASEAN, it's not likely to change the structural factors that drive mobility. With aging populations and labor shortages in key destination countries, and unemployment and low wages in many countries of origin, the regional disparities in development will largely remain. Efforts to nationalize the workforce and labor-intensive industries in some ASEAN countries have so far failed to fill that gap. It's pretty hard to foresee that these factors changing in the short to medium term. And instead, what we could certainly see is increases in irregular migration and greater vulnerability to exploitation if borders remain tightly shut for a prolonged period of time. I'd like to suggest that this is really an opportune time to start developing a more inclusive regional architecture for labor migration within ASEAN. In particular, one that supports safe migration for both women and men migrants and enables them to find employment in conditions of decent work. Expanding regional agreements for low and semi-skilled work would help to fill labor market needs and expand the channels available for women and men to migrate legally and with the benefit of full protection under labor and social protection laws. It's my hope that COVID-19 will help ASEAN governments to recognize the critical role that migrant workers play in their economies and their societies, and take concrete action to ensure safe and rewarding migration experiences for all migrant workers. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. I think you've raised a lot of the points that we'll certainly want to come back to in the Q&A, and I think the sort of central question will be whether COVID pandemic represents a kind of break point in a positive direction, or actually just these same patterns continue, and if anything get worse. As you say, if borders remain closed, does that serve as a wake-up call, or does that just push the flows further underground? Great. Okay, so next I would like to invite Dr. Koh Sin Yee, Senior Lecturer in Global Studies at Monash University. Her expertise covers migration, urbanization, and social change. Prior to her academic career, she was an urban development professional in Singapore, and her research covers migration, mobilities, inclusion and exclusion, urban capital, and enabling agents. So very interested to hear Dr. Koh's perspective on the movement of people under the pandemic. Over to you, Dr. Koh.
Thank you, Laurence. Let me share my screen. Okay. So thanks again to the Institute for the invitation to be part of this panel. So before I start, I just want to cover some caveats. Firstly, I'm not a specialist on ASEAN migration. I'm also not a specialist on migration governance. So what I'm going to talk about today is largely in response to this session's title, which is Closing Borders, what's the future of ASEAN migration? And what I'm going to do is to talk about 4 points that I want to raise. So to respond to the question about borders closing and the future of migration for ASEAN, I think that borders will probably won't be fully closed, at least in the longer term. What I mean here is that even if borders are physically closed in the short term, or perhaps in relation to certain types of migrants, but there are other ways for migration and migration-related mobilities to take effect. And shifting the gaze onto ASEAN countries, we have heard from the previous two presentations that there's great reliance and dependency of ASEAN countries on migrants. And this reliance and dependency is not going to go away very soon. The International Labour Migration Statistics database for ASEAN indicates that about 2/3 of international migrants in ASEAN come from other ASEAN member states. And we have heard from Armand's earlier presentation about the details of those kinds of dependencies. The same database also indicates that migrant workers from ASEAN member states constitute a significant proportion of migrant workers' stock in ASEAN destination countries. So in particular, countries like Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, as well as Brunei to a certain extent. Now, the data from the International Labour Organization and the World Bank estimated that in the case of Malaysia, the migrant workers in Malaysia constitute between 20 to 40% of the overall labor force in 2019. The data from the Ministry of Human Resources indicates that about 70% of foreign workers employed in Malaysia are engaged in these three sectors: manufacturing, construction, and plantation. So in summary, we can see that national economies as well as the ASEAN regional economy is very heavily reliant on migrant workers. Now, if we shift the gaze beyond just looking at labor migrants, looking at international students, for example, international students as migrants, in the case of Malaysia, international students contribute an average of 7.2 billion to Malaysia per year via their tuition fees and other living expenses. And in 2019, international students in Malaysia's private higher education market contributed 17 billion ringgit to the country's GDP. And Malaysia has this planned target to attract 250,000 international students by the year of 2025. Malaysia also has a goal to become an international as well as regional education hub. So here you see that in addition to labor migrants, there's also interest on the part of Malaysia, in this case, to attract international students. And we can consider international students as a group of migrants too. On the other hand, in the case of Malaysia as well, we can also look at medical tourism, right? This is also one economic sector that the Malaysian government is interested in developing. This year, the medical tourism market in Malaysia was originally expected to draw 2 billion ringgit in terms of revenue, but it had to be adjusted to 500 million ringgit because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we see here again is heavy reliance and dependency of ASEAN countries on migrants, and this reliance is probably not going to go away very soon. What we're going to see, I think, is alternative kinds of arrangements. So for example, you have travel corridors or bubble flights. The most recent example being the Singapore-Hong Kong travel bubble, which was supposed to commence earlier this week, but is now suspended because of increase in COVID-19 cases in Hong Kong. Other alternative arrangements could be in the form of eliminating the need to actually travel and cross borders in the first place. So in relation to medical tourism, for example, we can see the development of telehealth for medical tourists. This could be one way that eliminates the need to travel physically, but also make it possible for companies and governments to tap onto this market. What we are going to see also is that the importance of health as an additional criteria for border control. And we have seen this in the development and discussions about digital health passports. So my second point is that what we're going to see perhaps is a shift towards regional mobilities rather than international mobilities per se. And I say this because the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that increasingly things like health concerns, travel restrictions, and tighter and unpredictable visa regulations, as well as incidences of racism in so far popular migration destinations, for example, in the US, UK, and Australia, may result in people looking to regional migration. And this means, in the context of ASEAN, regional migration within ASEAN or perhaps within Asia, rather than further afield. So, for example, the South China Morning Post last month has published an article that talks about how Chinese families are shunning Western universities because of these uncertainties about how those governments are handling the COVID-19 pandemic, uncertainties regarding visas, and so on and so forth. So for these parents, they are considering putting their children into their domestic education system or considering education systems in ASEAN countries. So for example, Singapore or Malaysia. This is where I think ASEAN countries can come into the picture to provide solutions for migrants and families that are looking to regional migration rather than international migration. Looking again at the case of Malaysia, Malaysia has been developing its private higher education sector, specifically in terms of transnational and offshore branch campuses as well. So these kinds of transnational and offshore education offerings might be attractive as an alternative for people who are looking to education migration, for example. In relation to that as well, we have seen that EduCity in Iskandar, Malaysia in Johor has recently come up with an alternative business plan, which was to establish itself as a transit hub that allows students who enroll in international institutions to actually study online but physically within EduCity itself. So this example shows that there are alternative possibilities that can coexist with perhaps certain closures of borders. So that leads me to my third point, which is about new opportunities. Now, with this changing migration considerations and mobility trends, I think there will be new opportunities for businesses and service providers to fill in the market gaps that have been created by these new demands. These services may not necessarily be directly related to migration, but they will have implications for migration and mobilities. So for example, things like rapid testing for COVID-19, which is then linked to what I talked about earlier, digital health passports, right? So if considering that health and health certification becomes important for border control, migration regulation, and for people to move across borders in the first place. So things like services for rapid testing, documentation and certification, standardization, translation, interpretation, these are all potential opportunities. In relation to that, there could also be in the realm of digital platforms that can support other types of mobilities that may not involve physical migration. And one good example would be online teaching, for example, or telehealth that I spoke about earlier. So here there are opportunities for ASEAN member states in terms of bilateral or regional agreements on regional mobilities, for example. But lastly, my last point, which is the most important point, I think, is to think about the questions of equality, equity, and shared responsibilities that the two earlier speakers have also talked about. We need to, again, go back to our assumptions about who gets to travel, who gets to cross borders and why, who gets to move faster or with less hassles and why, and beyond this, what kinds of implications does this new landscape of mobilities bring forth? Will it actually exacerbate existing inequalities and those structures of discrimination that we have talked about? And so how should governments and stakeholders attempt to address this collectively, as well as perhaps within national governments? So this is especially important given that there is significant undocumented and irregular migration within the ASEAN region, as well as informal channels of recruitment and remittances, which are subject to a lot of exploitation. So I'll end here and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koh. Yeah, I think that last point is very relevant. I think there's some positive messages to take from what you're saying, that there's sort of new opportunities, potentially more focus on regional rather than international travel. But I guess the risk is if it further separates the opportunities into those that can afford access to sufficient health to be health certified on the one hand, and then undocumented flows get pushed further underground potentially. So I think how we avoid that in the new normal is really important. Okay, and then thirdly, I'm very happy to invite my colleague, Dr. Juita Mohamad, who is Fellow for Economics, Trade and Regional Integration at ISIS Malaysia. So her research is focused on the impact of trade liberalization on wage inequality between skilled and unskilled workers. And her research interests include trade, regional integration, protectionism, wage inequality, and the informal sector. She previously worked at the OECD and at the Asia Development Bank. And we've been lucky enough to have Dr. Juita on a few of our webinars recently. So very pleased to hear from her again. And I understand Dr. Juita will be talking to us about a kind of particular case study, I think, that highlights some of the issues we've been talking about this morning. So over to you, Dr. Juita.
Thank you, Laurence, and thank you to Ideas for inviting me to this wonderful session among experts. Today, I would like to talk a bit about the Palau community of more known as the Bajau Laut in Sabah. So we have seen that there have been a decrease in the COVID-19 cases in Sabah, but in October 30th, we saw that cases in a single day reached about 466 number of cases. So what is devastating is that the total cases at that time have reached more than 11,000 since earlier this year, with the number of deaths also on the rise. Just like in the peninsula, the partial lockdown has impacted businesses and employment negatively for those both in the formal and informal sectors. Demand has been weak as consumers move to prioritize spending to essential goods, uncertain of how many more CMCOs or MCO extensions they will see. So while the poor, youth, and women have been hit hard, another segment that I would like to highlight that has been negatively impacted by this pandemic is actually the Palau community. And they're considered a minority, ethnic. They live on boats and they lead a nomadic lifestyle. They live near the shores and can be dispersed from Kudat and all the way to Semporna. There is also a part of the community who are living near the seashores on stilt houses. Given their skills and their talent in fishing, it is no surprise that their main occupation is tied to the sea. What makes them even more vulnerable is the backdrop of the spread of the virus, and the partial lockdown is actually their status in Malaysia. Most of them are very much still undocumented, even though they have lived among us for many generations, up to 7 generations. A recent survey in 2018 estimated that about 60,000 people are undocumented in Sabah. And I feel that this is a big underestimation. Without proper documentation, they do not have access to healthcare nor to education. Without proper education, they're trapped in a cycle of perpetual poverty. Their kids will be poor and their grandchildren will be poor. So I was given the opportunity to do field work in Semporna in August this year and observe firsthand how education has the power to transform a person's life, a family's destiny, and the fate of the community. I visited 2 schools that cater to the undocumented children, mostly from the Palau community, equipping them with basic knowledge of mathematics, English, and Bahasa Melayu, among others. So one school, which was set up by an NGO called Haluan, was located in Kampung Hidayat, Boom Boom Island, while another one is located on Mabul Island. on Mabul Island, the school is actually funded by a local resort owner, Mr. Big John. So as funding is an issue, education is only given to a targeted age group. So it can be from 6 to 9, but no more than 12 years old of age. So again, in Big John's school in Mabul, around 90 children are divided into 3 spaces in their tiny school, catering to children from 7 to 9. Even with the dire state of the school with limited resources, the children loved learning there, and their motivation exudes from their smiling faces. Even with basic education, the community will always be bound to live as fishermen. If they are successful, they can become middlemen or taukees in their fishing community, but without any proper documentation, they will not be able to secure formal jobs anywhere, as employers will be penalized if they are found to employ those without documents. So additionally, due to the kidnapping and also the piracy issues in Sabah waters, employees need to be insured. And again, you can only be insured if you are registered. With a restrictive life bound by the sea, we saw that the Palau youth also suffer. In Semporna, we saw children and teenagers be begging for food near the jetty. We also saw teenage and young boys out cold at the lobby of commercial districts and government agency buildings, intoxicated by industrial glue gum. Most of them live in the Kampung area adjacent to Semporna. So again, recently with the CMCO being implemented in Sabah, this has affected their livelihoods as they heavily depend on demand from mainland Sabah. So without sales from the daily catch, that can be used to buy other essential goods to feed and protect their families, they're left exposed and unprotected. As they're undocumented, they will not be eligible to the government's assistance, pushing them further into poverty, into the mercy of heroic NGOs who have been pushing for the registration of the community. So again, with cases also on the rise within the Palau community, the fear of possible deportation grows after they are brought to the quarantine centers in mainland Sabah to recover. So again, without proper care of low and high risk cases among them, the fight to end the spread of COVID-19 will perpetuate. So if there was no sense of urgency before in providing them with proper documents, there is an urgency now as their lives depend on this very effort that can be solely provided by the government. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Juita. Yeah, I think that also underpins that in some areas this becomes quite complicated because we're talking about not just sort of classical migration flows as someone like me might understand them coming from Europe. It's also about lack of good documentation within countries that actually blurs the line between a migrant and undocumented workers and local workers and so on. So I think further underpins the need for a discussion on how we govern all of this. Okay, so we now have we'll now move into the panel discussion, into the Q&A. So please feel free to share any further questions on the Q&A. Some have already come in. Some of our panelists have been kind to respond in writing on a couple, but I might bring back some of those points because I think they're important. I want to start by asking, by coming back to Benjamin, I think, and asking this question about, I think in your presentation, I think you sort of framed the COVID moment as a wake-up call on migration. And I think I just want to ask, not to challenge that idea, but to see, how you feel about whether it will be a wake-up call or actually whether it will actually worsen the situation. Because as Dr. Koh highlighted, what's going to happen is that potentially as borders open up, it might do so in a way that exacerbates inequality because there will be scope for those who can afford it to navigate the new channels because it requires sort of health certification or whatever. But those demands aren't going away. So the borders will have to continue to allow for flexibility, even if that's kind of pushed further underground and less regulated. So I guess I want to ask you, which way do you see that political journey or that process going, so far? Do you see any signals to be optimistic that this will be a wake-up call, or do you think the signals are actually more negative, that actually the pandemic will just continue to exacerbate these current negative dynamics? Sorry, that was directed to Benjamin. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my connection's a little bit weak, but I'll try. Yeah, thanks for the question, Todd. Laurence Todd, sorry. I think from me, it's a very difficult question to answer with any assurance. I think traditionally, labor migration policy within ASEAN follows the model of ASEAN policy in general, where it's very much sort of developed through consensus. It's not particularly formulated in a legally binding way, and in many cases doesn't get implemented to any real great extent. Particularly what you had with the ASEAN consensus was really a very extended period of time where countries of origin and countries of destination couldn't really reach agreement and sort of had to compromise on a somewhat reduced international instrument for how they were going to govern labor mobility within ASEAN. So on that side, I think from the ASEAN side, yes, there's reason to be a bit skeptical. But I also think what COVID has brought about really will highlight the fact of just how dependent many ASEAN countries are on labor migration. In a country like Thailand, where you have 4 to 5 million migrant workers, they just can't afford to be without the migrant workforce. Those are jobs that nationals no longer find attractive. There are more desirable jobs that pay better that those workers are going to want to pursue. So you really, and broader speaking, they have one of the fastest aging societies within ASEAN. So they really need more workers to fill these lower skilled jobs. And, workers in countries of origin want those jobs. I'm in Myanmar. There are millions of workers here who are unemployed and underemployed and need, better paying jobs. So they will pursue those jobs, whether or not the borders open quickly, or whether or not there are strict procedures in place for preventing infection and regulating recruitment. So I think you're going to see probably large increases in irregular migration if the procedures are not put in place to facilitate that movement. I just think it's likely to be an increasing phenomenon in destination countries, which is going to be hard to ignore. So I think in that sense, it's just something that the destination countries will have to come to terms with, because we know they are so concerned about this issue of irregular migration. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. Yeah, I'd like to come back to the actual policy instruments at the regional level. But I think first, another question, I think to Dr. Koh. So this touches on a question that was answered that I think that Juita has already addressed somewhat about how do we see government solving this issue, and when businesses come to rely on the current way that migrant flows operate, at a very low cost. in your presentation, Dr. Koh, you sort of signaled that there was going to be, new opportunities, and that's a positive thing, but that also we need to achieve that equity. And I think, when we consider some of the issues that have been raised this morning, ultimately, one of the questions comes down to, are businesses prepared to pay more to have access to migrant labor? So do you think, what's your perspective on that? Do you feel that as part of the new normal, there's going to need to be an acceptance from business that there needs to be a higher price on labor? And how do you see impacting this situation and being able to realize some of those opportunities you described in your presentation?
Okay, that's a very difficult question. That would be, I think, any question that national as well as regional governments will try to get an answer at. It's complex because, as the first presentation has also told us about, there are different strengths of currencies across the different countries, and that has in some part contributed to migration flows in the first place, right? So migrants migrate because they can have a higher earning power in the destination countries, that they can send remittances back home because the value of their wages would be so much higher at home. And because of this currency differences, that is why businesses are capitalizing on this, right? Which is why businesses are able to employ migrant workers at a much lower wage compared to locals, for example. So it's a difficult problem to resolve, whether or not businesses will be willing to pay more wages to either locals or even migrant workers. I don't think that's an automatic thing on the part of businesses. It requires policy interventions as well. So for example, minimum wage or some other kinds of labor protection, as well as human rights and social protection that goes along with it. I think one issue is that oftentimes we look at these problems as isolated problems, whether it's a migration problem or labor problem or human trafficking problem or something else. But oftentimes it's really an integrated whole, and that is why it's a complex problem.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koh. I want to ask, there's a question here on documentation that I want to ask to you, Dr. Juita. So given that most of the ASEAN countries are already facing problems in documenting their own domestic workforce, what would be a good first step to ensure that work conditions of both domestic and foreign workers within a country can grow in tandem? So be interested for your perspective on that, specifically given, that you in your work at the moment are highlighting how those lines become quite blurred. I mean, how do you think we can improve the situation for undocumented domestic workers alongside undocumented foreign workers and make that a sort of mutually reinforcing process?
That is a difficult question. I think the underlying practice should be on widely having widely available access to registration activities. So for example, for the Palau community in Sabah, for now, not all of them are documented, but some of them are documented. But even with the documentation, it is not standardized. So some are documented, or some they have the IMM13 pass cards, and others they have the burong cards, and another part also have the survey certificate. So again, what Sabah is trying to do under the minister at the Prime Minister's office, Dato' Sri Muhammad Rizwan, is actually to standardize all of these document holders and to only have the IMM13 pass be the ultimate document for the the undocumented ones in Sabah anyways. But again, yeah, that is a difficult question about registering both foreign and also local workers, especially when most of a significant portion of our workers are actually in the informal sector. So in businesses, especially during the pandemic, the digitization of delivery, food delivery platforms have actually enticed, should be attracting the informal workers to become, or the informal, in the informal sectors to become a part of the mainstream economy. So for example, if you are interested in partaking or in participating in Food Panda or Grab Food, you need to be registered by the SSM. So again, this and the registration cost is at a very low, it's at a very low cost. So again, this should be attractive enough for the informal sector to become in the mainstream sector. But again, I think what is unattractive for them is the corporate taxes that they have to pay. So again, this is something that the government is trying to solve, especially when it comes to financial assistance, because if you're not registered, if you're not listed, then you will not be able to get the assistance that you are eligible for. So again, there's a push and pull factor here, and so it's costly to be registered or listed, but then you will also get the benefits if and only if you are registered as like a formal worker or as a formal business owner. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Juita. I think, yeah, I mean, it kind of also then raises the question of who pays for that process, which is something that we touched on earlier, and whether we can have an equitable system in terms of the distribution of that cost, and in whether we can get to a point where it's sort of businesses feel that that's a sort of sound investment and a reasonable cost. Okay, I want to address one of the questions here to Benjamin. So it's a question from Jean asking whether, recognizing that illegal migrants constitute such significant numbers, is there how can we pursue a process of legalization that doesn't expose those migrants to the risks of deportation? So I think there have been historically cases of quite notable amnesties, including for refugees in the past. But obviously what happened in Malaysia was, quite a mixed experience in terms of the approach taken to illegal migrants during the health crisis. So what is your perspective on how we should approach that question of sort of normalizing or regularizing those illegal migrants that are already here in different ASEAN member states?
Yeah, thanks, Laurence. I mean, it's a enduring question for ASEAN migration. It's largely sort of accepted that probably around half of migrants are in destination countries without legal status. And generally speaking, what you often see is that migrants will journey through a whole range of legal statuses during their time abroad, because it is the way the system is set up. It's very hard to maintain regular legal status over the long term. So yeah, it's a real challenge, and the way countries like Malaysia and Thailand have addressed it is largely through these amnesty programs, as you've raised. In many cases, those have been even coupled with crackdowns to incentivize migrants to participate. So they will register people and then immediately try to deport everyone who didn't register, which it hasn't really worked very, very effectively. It has to be said. I mean, I think the larger answer is you need cheaper, more accessible, less complex ways for migrants to go abroad from the start with regular legal status. That's not an easy issue, of course, and particularly raises the issue of private recruitment agencies who are very powerful element within the labor mobility systems within Asean, and how do you shift the costs that they charge to migrants to employers. But yeah, I mean, I think in the long term, that has to be the way forward, that you find ways to facilitate labor migration, which are sort of less putting the burden on migrant workers because they're poor and they badly need well-paying jobs, and shift more of that burden onto employers who are benefiting from the services that migrants are providing to them as workers. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you. I mean, yeah, so it seems to come sort of back to this question of, I mean, ultimately, are we sort of artificially lowering the price of labor, and that is driving this, driving some of these social problems. And then, so it comes back to the question that we're prepared to pay, in the first instance, the businesses are prepared to pay for access to labor, and ultimately the prices that consumers are prepared to pay for the goods and services. So I think, it's important to recognize that. I think, what we've been trying to get at is that if this system is sort of conspiring to lower the cost of labor in a way that's like socially unsustainable, then ultimately that's something that has to be corrected somewhere in the market. Okay, I want to pose this next question to Dr. Koh from Bill, because I think it gets into some of the opportunities that you were just describing. So the question is, how would digital technologies enable or impede cross-border collaborations, and what is the impact on migration in the new COVID normal future? So I think this comes back, I think in a way it's asking you to unpack a little bit what you signaled, which is that there are going to be new opportunities in terms of regional migration, regional mobility, but also that there are sort of new considerations in that new normal. And I wanted to return to that point because I was quite interested in what you were saying about the digital health passport. And for me, although I think that represents a really good opportunity in terms of facilitating travel, I can also see the risk in terms of the inequities that might arise. So I think it'd be very interesting if you could comment on the role of technology in the new normal for migration within ASEAN, and what are some of the risks and opportunities of that?
Thanks. That's a very good question. So let me try and address it. It's actually two parts to the question. The first part is asking how would digital technologies enable or impede cross-border collaborations? Now, I think we need to unpack what we mean by digital technologies in the first place. If we are talking about digital platforms specifically, I think digital platforms, in terms of enabling cross-border collaborations, we have seen that happening. For example, you can see that now there's greater opportunities for remote work. And here I don't mean just local work from home, but working internationally in a remote kind of arrangement. So that enables greater opportunities for people to access these kinds of opportunities that perhaps were not so available to them previously. These digital platforms can also enable people to build networks that are not dependent on co-presence or physical meetings. And the value of networks could bring longer term benefits. So for example, building these networks can lead to skills transfers to a certain extent, and this will then have longer term implications. But on the other hand, these digital platforms can also impede in terms of the existing digital divide. Only those people who already have access to be able to make use of these digital platforms can benefit more from them rather than people who are excluded from them. These digital platforms will also exacerbate existing structures of inequalities beyond just the digital divide. So for example, language, or other kinds of circumstances, individual and familial circumstances that people have. But the issue that these digital platforms and digital technologies bring about is that it might push people into the gig economy, right? As we increasingly rely on these digital platforms and digital technologies, you have more and more people pushed into the gig economy that comes with less protection. They have uncertain employment prospects, and so on and so forth. Now, the second part of the question is about the impact of digital technologies on migration in the COVID-19 normal future. I'd like to return to the point I made earlier about new migration trends that could be much more focused on local and regional mobilities. Because of the availability of digital technologies, people might change their aspirations for migration, right? If there's no need for longer distance migration, they may look to shorter distance migration, for example. The other thing about digital technologies is that there's also increasing automation that Dr. Juita has talked about earlier. Automation means that there's transformations in the demand for skills as well as the demand for labor. So this will have longer term implications beyond COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koh. I think I want to ask a couple of connected questions, which we've sort of touched on, but are really around, I guess, on the policy side. So I think I want to come back to a question that Dr. Juita has already answered, but I just want to bring it up because it connects to the discussion we were having yesterday about Rcep. So I wanted to ask Dr. Juita about, what role do you see for kind of regional trade agreements, Rcep, CPTPP, in providing some clearer structure and clearer governance around some of the issues that we've been discussing this morning? Do you think there is potential in those mechanisms and those platforms, or do you think that that's, it's a bit of window dressing, and really those agreements aren't going to kind of address these issues?
Thank you for that timely question. Yes, I believe that if Malaysia were to ratify the CPTPP agreement, then we would need to adhere to the discipline chapters involving the labor chapter. And I think there are around 7 different laws that need to be ratified for Malaysia, specifically on the labor chapter. So this would protect the rights of the foreign workers, not just foreign workers, but foreign and local workers in terms of working condition, wages, and whatnot. So again, I'm personally very, very, very sad that Malaysia hasn't yet ratified the CPTPP. But on the bright side, I see that there's a potential for Rcep to be upgraded in the future to include these discipline chapters, which can include labor, environment, and also on patent, if there isn't one just yet. But yes, definitely, I'm very much looking forward to Malaysia finally ratifying it, because it gives a lot of discipline for government procurement, for example, for SOEs, and especially on labor policies here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Juita. I mean, I'd like to ask you, Benjamin, I guess a version of that same question, but I mean, thinking then about some of the other policy tools that we've touched on. So in Armand's presentation, you know, he was highlighting ratification of ILO conventions. You know, the context for this discussion is looking at ASEAN, and in the past under this program, we've looked at things like the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, you know, which I think has a bit of a mixed record in terms of being able to kind of drive real policy change. Then we have some of these other stricter, more legally binding regional instruments such as Rcep. CPTPP is not an ASEAN vehicle, but has some ASEAN members in it. And then of course we have the kind of policy of the member state. I mean, what's your perspective on kind of where the most, the policy levers that we should focus on? And, you know, specifically perhaps, you know, how important do you see ILO ratification, ILO convention ratification as part of that sort of patchwork of responses? Or do you see that risks being, you know, superficial and it only really matters if we get into the domestic member state policy? Be very interested in your reflections on that.
Sure, thanks Laurence. I mean, I'm a former ILO staff member, so I mean, ratification of international labor standards is near and dear to my heart. They do actually have teeth. So if an international labor standard is ratified, it means that it is included within the national legislative framework. And yeah, I mean, that means it has to be implemented, and it is actually regularly monitored by the ILO in terms of compliance with the articles of the conventions. So that has real teeth, and I think that would be great. I think the reality is that, you know, many ASEAN member states are, because of that, quite reluctant to particularly implement the international labor standards relating to migration. For example, Convention 181 on private employment agencies would mean that you could not charge any recruitment fees to migrant workers. So that's, yeah, I mean, that's a big ask considering the status quo right now, where pretty much all of the costs are placed onto migrant workers. So yeah, I mean, I think further advocacy on international labor standards would be wonderful. I think the issue that was brought up with trade agreements and labor chapters within them is very important, and I think there is scope for some of those agreements to have a you know, real positive impact. That has already sort of been the case with discussions in Malaysia, where particularly compliance on issues of forced labor and freedom of association have been raised. But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the abuses against migrant workers are not necessarily within global supply chains. So that is a feature, of course, of migration in ASEAN, that the workers are coming to get these manufacturing jobs in garments or fishing jobs with which the fish are exported abroad, etc. But there is a lot of abuse taking place in sectors which provide goods and services to domestic markets. And here in particular, I think I would again raise the issue of domestic work, which is you know, a huge issue in Malaysia and Singapore and Thailand, where these workers are almost entirely not even recognized as workers within the current legal frameworks. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a place for a signing of trade agreements to improve conditions, but I think it has to be coupled with additional agreements at national and regional level, which protect workers who otherwise might fall through the cracks of that sort of agreement.
Thanks, Benjamin. I wonder if I could just quickly follow up just on one thing. I mean, because you mentioned specifically, you know, the recruitment agencies and the convention that would sort of bite in terms of the scope that recruitment agencies have to kind of extract, I guess, some profit from this whole process. And that was part of what Armand was describing. I mean, perhaps this is a naive question for me, but why is it, if you can comment, that recruitment agencies would hold sort of quite a lot of power in terms of this current situation and be able to exert that kind of restraining force on policy change in this space? I mean, presumably recruitment agencies don't represent a big part of the economy. I can see more like structural barriers around, for example, where an economy is dependent on remittances. They might be nervous about doing things that kind of constrains migrant flows. But for the kind of relative, for the sort of profiteering of recruitment agencies, why is that something that's politically difficult to challenge in member states?
Yeah, it's a good question, and a complicated one. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that recruitment agencies in many cases have a lot of powerful political ties in many ASEAN countries, both in destination and origin. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you can't ignore that there is a level of corruption often involved in formulating policy to regulate recruitment agencies, and they're often formulated in a way that are to the benefit of private recruitment agencies. So that's part of it. I mean, I think on the migrant side, there's just few options. If you want to get a better paying job, if you're a migrant in Myanmar and there's a job in Korea that pays, $1,000 a month, there's a lot of competition for those jobs. So you kind of feel like you have to pay whatever you have to pay to get them. That's, yeah, they just don't have sort of the option of comparing between options to find a lower cost channel for migration. There's a lot of collusion as well between recruitment agencies. I mean, what often happens in terms of improving regulation is to sort of set more standardized costs for migration so that everyone's paying the same amount. But at the moment, what migrants pay is kind of just set among recruitment agencies, whatever the market will bear. And that's often thousands and thousands of dollars for migrants who are often migrating for fairly low wage jobs. So yeah, it's not really proportional to what the actual benefits that they're receiving from their migration in many cases. And that does lead to these problems that were raised earlier around debt bondage, where a migrant might have to work for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years even, just so that they can pay off the costs of their migration. Thanks.
Yes, thanks very much, Benjamin. I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, there was a point that I don't think Armand covered in his presentation, but something that we mentioned in the paper, in the briefing we published last week, which is that, how is the pandemic, but also market pressure going to change some of this? So, sustainability from an environmental perspective, but actually also from labor standards perspective, is becoming increasingly important for investors. And also other international governments taking action on what they see as unsustainable labor practices. A point that was raised in the Q&A was around the recent instance of glove manufacturers being sanctioned by US Customs after reports of human rights abuses. Now, that's a really important driver of market behavior, because if as the pressure increases for sustainable labor practices on highly profitable, important parts of the economy, like right now, the glove manufacturers are a big part of the Malaysian economy. If there's pressure coming from that side, I mean, does that change the kind of balance of political and economic calculation in terms of improving standards. We've also seen action taken in the palm oil sector. So I wonder if, alongside the pandemic, hopefully changing investor, changing international regulator perspectives with respect to sustainability will also act as a driver in terms of shaping market behavior. But anyway, that's just a reflection and maybe something we can come back to. But I want to ask Dr. Koh two related questions that have been raised, which are sort of not entirely are kind of connected to that last point, which are questions from Guido about whether businesses are sort of willing to embrace the opportunities of the new normal and the remote style of working. And it's interesting because, in my direct circles, I have experienced people who work for employers that aren't comfortable for them to work from home and insist they come to the office. That's putting some strain on certain family situations and so on. So I just wanted to ask, what's your perspective in terms of, are businesses prepared to kind of adapt to these new opportunities and this new way of working, or do you expect to see some resistance and trying to maintain the status quo?
Thanks for that question. So I think we need to remember that COVID-19 is a watershed moment, right? This is a watershed moment when a lot of things are going to be transformed and changed. And Benjamin talked about this being a reality check. So I think this is really a moment for all of us to question our existing assumptions and to question the status quo. So for employers and businesses, this may be about questioning their assumptions about the nature of work. Of course, this needs to be considered in specific sectors and specific companies. For example, certain companies may be very willing to embrace this kind of remote work. And in fact, I know of companies that have completely done away with a physical office, right? To save rent, for example, or realizing that this is the future way that the business wants to operate in the future. So it really depends on that specific company and business. But going back to my earlier point about COVID-19 being a watershed moment, it may involve uncomfortable acceptance of what we think of as normal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koh. I think, I hope that businesses recognize the option for flexibility, but that also creates a sort of space for, for workers, both domestic and foreign, to be able to, seize those opportunities rather than be sort of trapped, in ways of working that are not sustainable or not conducive to, well, certainly to their health in the short term. Dr. Juita, I want to come back to a question that was asked that I think you addressed, but I want to press you on a different aspect of the question, which is about the pandemic, highlighting some of these challenges, but how do we, I think, but also recognizing the political barriers to change. So both in terms of the international migration challenges and also in some of the domestic undocumented workers. So, in the case of, your work in Sabah or more generally in Malaysia, what do you see as, what will it take to create a political consensus to seriously move to address these issues and, improve the governance of, undocumented workers and undocumented migrants and improve the governance at a regional level? I mean, is that something that you see is shifting, or do you see that there are still significant political barriers, and do you see that that's getting better or worse, and what overall do you think we can do to continue to kind of advocate for better governance?
So again, with the Palau community, this is not a new issue. It has been an ongoing issue for the past decades. And it's going to get worse because the population is increasing. And as I mentioned before, since they are trapped, they cannot find formal employment, then this will actually lead them to, this issue will lead to other societal issues. And it can also become like a security issue. So because the population or the Palau community is very vulnerable, they're open to the influence of like the pirates. This was the case a few years ago when the pirates infiltrated their kampongs and they hid them within their midst. So again, it is in the interest of the Malaysian government, I feel, to register them so that their rights are protected, so that they will not go to other parties to seek refuge. So again, when youth are unemployed, you know, they can be involved in criminal activities. And then again, it's costly for the government not to register them. Registration would not incur such a high cost. It is very doable. It has been pushed for in the past years. It has been executed, but in different parts of Sabah in different ways. So again, standardization of procedure of how to register the Palau people is very much needed. But again, it's the longer we let this problem sit, the more there's a high probability that the problem will bite us back. So it is again in our interest to register them or to formalize them. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Juita. Yeah, I hope we can, you know, work together to make that case to the government so that we do see change on these issues. Okay, I want to just ask one more question, and I'm going to direct it at Benjamin. I want to pick up this question that's been put by Greg, because it also connects to the point I was making before about whether we're going to see increased pressure from an ESG sustainability perspective to improve labour standards. So the question is, you know, is there scope for the private sector to reform sort of, you know, independently, in the absence of being driven by direct regulation? So for example, the construction sector has large companies that may be concerned about their reputation. I mentioned, you know, we've seen in palm oil, we've seen in the glove manufacturing, quite significant implications from, you know, the use of unsustainable labor practices. So do you see, maybe not at the government level, but do you see in the private sector any positive trends in terms of trying to proactively respond and improve things independently?
Yeah, thanks, Laurence. I mean, I think it's a good question, and of course, you know, supply chain management and sustainability are kind of front and center in terms of approaches for addressing these issues currently. I think there's space for it. I mean, I think you're not going to solve these problems without engaging in the private sector because, yes, frankly, if you're going to point fingers, the private sector is largely responsible for the abuses against migrants. So they need to be part of the solution. I think the models that have been developed thus far have some serious limitations. So in particular, corporate social responsibility initiatives, sustainability initiatives are largely voluntary. And what that often leads to is sort of these commitments which actually don't make much difference in terms of improving conditions for workers on the ground. They're very much sort of window dressing, lip service to improving conditions because of reputational concerns within their consumer markets. I think, you know, what needs to happen is, not only more political will from the private sector to improve labor practices for their suppliers in particular, but also, more directly engaging with workers themselves. So when these kinds of approaches have worked, it's largely because they're really listening to the voices of migrant workers themselves and finding out, what their needs are, what their demands are for improved conditions, rather than just sort of unilateral corporate social responsibility initiatives from the private sector side. There's a newly emerging model called worker-driven social responsibility, which has a lot of potential. It's already been very beneficial in the US for agricultural workers in many areas where there are actual legally binding agreements signed between workers and the buyers within supply chains to sort of meet a certain labor standard within their supply chains. I think those kinds of more binding approaches which engage workers are much more likely to be successful in improving conditions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. I think at this point we need to wrap up. So I think we've covered most of the questions. Apologies if there's something that we didn't answer adequately, but I think in this 50 minutes we've covered a range of different topics. So I'll just give each of our panelists just 30 seconds or so just to make any final concluding remarks, and maybe just to give the sort of final sense of where do you think we'll be in a year or however long forward in the future in terms of what the pandemic will have done to some of these issues, these migration issues that we've highlighted. Either the positive side, what are the opportunities, or the negative side, how can we address some of those governance gaps? So because we just heard from Benjamin, maybe I'll go to Dr. Koh first to wrap up with her concluding remarks.
Thanks, Laurence. So to wrap up, I want to return to my last point, which is about issues of equity and protection. I think the COVID-19 pandemic and situation has shown us that we are actually in this together globally, not just in our respective countries or within ASEAN, but that things that are happening in other countries may eventually, not me, but will eventually affect us. So this is why it's really important to address questions of equity and human rights that all the panelists and presenters today have talked about, which underwrites migration in ASEAN so far. So looking forward, I think it's important to address these issues and questions first, and ultimately this will lead to the shared prosperity that ASEAN member countries are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koh. Dr. Juita, your closing remarks, please.
For the Palau community, I hope that registration efforts will continue to be standardized throughout Sabah, and that the community are able to access our education system, our healthcare system. And again, this is so that they won't be continuously marginalized, especially when Malaysia is seeking to be a high income status country in a couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juita. And finally, Benjamin, if you could provide us your closing thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I don't have a lot more to add, but yeah, I mean, I think for me, as I said, I hope that COVID-19 will really be a moment of recognition within ASEAN about how important intra-regional migration has become to the economies and societies within the region, and that migrant workers are really much more than just low-cost labor, that they contribute to the economic, social, and political life of the countries that they're in, and that, you know, the policies need to not instrumentalize migrant workers as just, you know, a low-cost source of labor. It needs to interact with them as you know, human beings who have, you know, all the rights and benefits of other people resident in those countries. So yeah, I mean, I hope, maybe it's optimistic, but I'm hopeful that, you know, given the sort of economic pain and suffering that COVID is bringing to many countries, will sort of lead to a realization that, you know, there needs to be more appreciation and support for the role of migrant workers within those countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I mean, I think that's a very good note on which to conclude the panel. I think that it's clear that migration is a driver of regional integration, and it's a source of great opportunity, both for individual migrants and for ASEAN member states as a whole to achieve goals of economic development. But I think we also recognize that the current system is flawed and leads to some economic inefficiencies and also some serious social costs and abuses. And I think that what we can hope is that the spotlight that has been placed on that by the pandemic provides what Benjamin said earlier, a wake-up call to ASEAN member states to pursue policies both at the domestic level and then also at the regional level to ensure a more inclusive model of migration within the region towards, I suppose, a more human capital approach where we prioritize investment in migrants and don't, as Benjamin just said there, instrumentalize them through policy. But if we can achieve that, I think then migration can continue to serve the goal of regional economic integration and to demonstrate to individual member states and ASEAN as a whole the opportunities and the economic opportunities that can come from sustainable regional integration. So on that note, I will draw this panel discussion to a close. And also, since this is the second and final day of our conference, I will draw the conference to an end. So thank you everybody who participated. Thank you very much again to our panelists, Mr. Benjamin Harkins, Dr. Koh Sin Yee, and Dr. Juita Mohamad. Very grateful for you to take the time with us this morning to discuss this important topic. And thank you very much to Armand as well for his presentation at the beginning of the session. And thank you to all our participants and for your great questions and your engagement both today and yesterday. We really appreciate it. Do please stay engaged with the work that Ideas does. You can subscribe to our newsletter. We hold many different events on different topics and also publications. So thank you very much for participating in this important discussion that we feel hasn't been given enough attention, and we want to try to do our part to raise this issue of migration with ASEAN as an opportunity, but something that also that needs to be improved.